Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where and when you are observing this video. My name is Dr. Andy Markels, and I am a professor of special education at James Madison University in Virginia, the United States. I am working with my colleague, Dr. Muhammad Corral, who is also a professor in special education at Sinop University in Turkey. We decided to put this professional development together for teachers in Turkey, just as a way to share some knowledge and skills, and hopefully you can learn something along the way. A few months ago, we sent a survey out to some colleagues and some teachers over in Turkey, and decided on doing a short professional development around the idea of classroom management, the concepts and the skills related to classroom management. So hopefully this is a beneficial professional development for you all. Like I said, I'm Andy Markels. Been at James Madison for just about a year now. And when I moved to this university, there were some colleagues here that had already had relationships with some teachers in schools over in Turkey and Istanbul. And so joining onto the team with them, I thought it'd be fun to provide some PD for you all to use as you see fit. So today we're going to be discussing classroom management, a variety of concepts, and let's dive right in. So I first wanted to maybe you ask yourself the question, what is the goal of teaching? Well, in essence, the goal of teaching is to change student behavior. It's to change behaviors by having them learn new knowledge and new skills, whether that's academic, knowledge in reading and writing and arithmetic, science, history, all those sorts of things. But it's also to change behaviors in how students learn how to interact with one another, how to communicate, for littler kids, how to share, how to get along, how to follow rules and procedures. So there's a lot of change that happens inside the classrooms. And so that's basically the goal of teaching. But behavior, whether it's academic behavior, emotional behaviors, social behaviors, there's a lot that goes into that. And so we're going to be looking at a couple different concepts. And the first one is analysis, right? The analysis is the determination or breakdown of anything that is complex. So behavior analysis is sort of the investigation of the causes of what organisms or humans do. So we're going to be kind of analyzing behaviors in the context of classroom management. And so it comes from this field of science called applied behavior analysis, or ABA. And special education as a field is deeply steeped in applied behavior analysis because we as professors want to look at behavior of students and understand, why it is they're doing what they're doing, and then how can we help them do it better, more effective, in different ways. And so applied behavior analysis is basically the scientific study of behavior. It's also the measurement of observed behaviors. So when a behavior is taking place, how do you observe it? How do you measure it? ABA recognizes that the environment that the student, that you, the teacher, are in plays a big role, it's an essential role in what's happening before and after a behavior occurs. So looking at that environment, what's happening before the behavior happens, whatever that behavior is, and then what's happening after that behavior. And so this is called a contingency, and we'll look into that a little bit more deeply. And then ABA provides procedures and tools to accomplish how you can predict and then influence behaviors. So you can predict student behaviors, and then you can influence those behaviors through a variety of strategies. So classroom management, the goal of classroom management is basically to create an environment that's supportive of learning and student responsibility, right? We want to create a classroom where students feel safe and are encouraged to learn. But students have to have their own responsibilities in controlling, their behaviors and engaging in appropriate behaviors and all those things that go into making a classroom successful. And so classroom management is this larger sort of concept of creating this environment to where those two things, student learning and student responsibility, can take place. And the good news is that there are steps that you can take to manage the environment so that students are motivated to engage in the behaviors that are critical for their success. We don't want students engaging in behaviors that are disruptive to their success and other successes. We want them to be motivated to do the right thing, to engage in appropriate behaviors, effective behaviors, as we'll discuss shortly, so that they can be successful and learn whether the content, learn how the social skills, learn all the things that make them, develop into what we want them to be. So two concepts to kind of parse out. First is that classroom management, the differences between classroom management and discipline, which you often hear discipline. Classroom management might be something that you hear and maybe you think they're similar, but they're a little different. Classroom management is about creating a safe, positive, and consistent environment where teaching and learning take place, kind of what we just talked about in the previous slide. Classroom management is proactive in that you as a teacher think about how to set up environments, how to engage students, what you can do to be proactive before behaviors that are inappropriate occur. So classroom management kind of takes this proactive approach, where discipline is a reactionary approach to behaviors. A behavior happens, discipline is provided as after a behavior occurs. Now, discipline is part of a larger classroom management strategy for sure. Discipline is a part of that, but classroom management is larger than simply a reactionary discipline strategy. It's also this proactive strategy. So here's a couple of theories to keep in mind as we talk about behavior, and before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of behavior. First of all, behavior that is repeated by a student, by anybody. When we talk about behavior, we're talking about adults, kids, our own behaviors. You can think about it personally, about your own behaviors of what you do, but in the context of students, behavior that is repeated demonstrates a level of competence in the behavior and a level of motivation to engage in that behavior. So if a student is demonstrating any behavior, they're able to do it, and they have some sort of motivation to do it. There's a motivation to engage in that behavior. On the contrary, behavior that does not occur or is not repeated demonstrates that the student, one, is unable to perform the behavior, or there's a lack of motivation to engage in that behavior. So a student that does not read, right, they either have not learned the skill set to read, like they cannot read because they haven't learned how to do it, or they're not motivated to demonstrate that they're able to read. And so a person's level of motivation on any given task is a function of how highly the person values the rewards that accompany successful completion and how much they expect to be successful when or if they attempt to do the task. So thinking about motivation is a student will engage in a behavior if they value what that behavior gets them. There's some sort of reward. There's some sort of, we'll talk about it, a consequence, something that comes after the behavior that they receive, that they value. So they're going to engage in a behavior so that they can get something. Something happens afterwards. And that is that consequence, as we'll call it, the thing that happens after is of enough value that the student thinks, "Oh, yes, I'm going to do this behavior because it's going to get me that thing," and whatever that thing is. And also, they also need to feel like they can be successful. Like, I'm going to do this behavior because it's going to work. That consequence that's going to happen afterwards is going to happen. And so this is why I'm engaging in this behavior. So this kind of breaks down the motivation behind behaviors. So to quickly sum up, by observing student behaviors, thinking about what we'll get into the antecedents and the consequences. Um, if you observe behaviors, you're going to be able to determine why what a student is motivated to do. And by determining what is influencing their behavior, you can then increase that motivation. Or you can attempt to decrease their motivation to act in ways that are not necessarily desirable. So, how does this all kind of relate to teaching? Well, when you're looking at student behaviors, it'll help you create an environment that is more conducive to learning. A critical part about an environment conducive to learning is effective academic instruction. So the actual instruction that you as a teacher are providing, the assignments, the content, right, the materials, the engagement that you're providing for your students is really the cornerstone of effective classroom management. When students are engaged in the material and the content, they're interested, right? They're going to have less disruptive behaviors. And also the the instruction that you're providing, if the students expect that they're going to be successful in it, right? They're going to be able to complete the task. They're gonna feel like they're going to learn something that's interesting and engage them, right? Then they're going to have less undesirable behaviors as well. So having effectively designed instruction really helps students know that they're going to be successful because like we talked about in behaviors, if they don't feel like they're going to be successful, then they're likely not going to engage in that behavior. So if they're not going to be successful completing the assignment or the worksheet, they're probably not going to be motivated to do so. So you have to gauge and design your instruction so that students can feel like they're going to be successful. So let's look at the differences between how teachers often approach academic problems versus behavioral, sort of social emotional problems. Well, academically, when a student, um, when we're teaching, math, reading, science, history, whatever it may be, teachers generally approach students by assuming that they're trying to make the correct response. If they're completing a math problem, we assume they're trying to get the right answer. If there was a mistake, then we provide practice. If the student gets the problem wrong, let's say the student is doing a math problem and they get the wrong answer, we assume that was a mistake. Like somewhere along the line, they made a mistake, it wasn't intentional, and so we provide practice for how to do it the right way, and then they learned how to do it. Uh, on the contrast, behaviorally, oftentimes teachers assume the student is trying to do the wrong behavior. If a student is acting out, and we assume that the student is choosing to do that. We assume it was an intentional response. We assume the student is intentionally acting that way. And oftentimes there's some sort of disciplinary action, like, sending them out of the classroom, providing a detention, providing them a verbal warning. Oftentimes, teachers do not provide any practice on what the appropriate behavior is. And then we assume the disciplinary action, the sending the student to the principal's office, giving them a detention or a suspension if it's a severe behavior. We assume that the student learned the right way by that disciplinary action. To look at this a little bit further, if a student performs an academic mistake, we assume that they maybe learned the wrong way. Like if they're doing a math equation, perhaps when they were learning it, they learned it the wrong way, and so we teach them, or we assume that maybe they were taught the wrong way, or they heard about the wrong way, or whatever. We look at the problem, we kind of figure out what they're doing wrong, and then we reteach them the correct way. And then we assume that they have been taught the skill and will perform it correctly in the future. So thinking about academic problems, it's always about, like, it's not intentional. The student is making a mistake. They don't mean to make that mistake. I just need to reteach them. They need a little bit more practice, and then they'll get the academic. If they're trying to learn how to read, they just need practice with the fluency, with the blending, with the sounds, the vocabulary. Maybe they've never learned that word before, so we teach them the meaning of that word. It's always an assumption that the student is making a mistake and it's not intentional. Behaviorally, it's often the case that we assume students are doing it on purpose. And this is kind of the difference between academic problems and behavioral problems. We assume that the student is choosing to act in this way. We are assuming the student refuses to behave in a way that's appropriate. We assume the student knows the correct way to behave, but they're just choosing not to. And so again, disciplinary action occurs. Oftentimes the student's taken out from the classroom, so they miss instruction. And then we assume that they've quote unquote learned their lesson, but not providing that extra practice, not diagnosing the problem of why the student is acting the way they are acting. We just sort of like students choosing to misbehave, they should know better. They're not doing it, so punishment occurs. Suspension, disciplinary action, a phone call home, scolding from the teacher, or whatever it may be. It's oftentimes behavioral problems are not diagnosed the same way that academic problems are happening. So there's one thing to think about in terms of behavior, appropriate versus inappropriate, and then we'll talk about effective versus ineffective. So a behavior that does not fulfill some expectation of someone who sees the behavior is inappropriate. And appropriate and inappropriate is really subjective. Some teachers think different behaviors are appropriate. Some teachers may enjoy classrooms where the students are calling out the answers and, competing for that attention. Other teachers may want every student to raise their hand and wait to be called on, right? And so a student that's shouting out an answer could be inappropriate behavior for one teacher, but appropriate behavior for another teacher. So appropriate versus inappropriate all kind of depends. So there is that subjectivity. But while keeping that in mind, there's also this idea of effective versus ineffective behaviors. An effective behavior results in the desired outcome. Ineffective behaviors do not result in a desired outcome. So whether it's appropriate or inappropriate may not matter for a student. They're more concerned about, is it getting them what they want? Is it an effective behavior? So a student that is wanting attention from the teacher may, jump up and down and wave their hands and get attention from the teacher. The teacher may say, hey, what do you want? That's might not be the most appropriate way to get attention, right? That might be considered an inappropriate way, but it worked. It was effective. So the student knows that jumping up and down and yelling is going to get the teacher's attention. Sitting quietly and raising your hand may not get the teacher's attention. That might be the more appropriate way to do so, but it may be ineffective. If the teacher just ignores the student who's quietly raising their hand and the teacher is over here, interacting with the students that are being loud and kind of calling out answers, the student that's quietly raising their hand is learning that this is an ineffective way to get the attention that I'm wanting. So I'm going to yell and shout like the other students. And so there's this play that's happening between what's appropriate, inappropriate versus effective and what's ineffective. And students are going to steer towards what's effective, regardless of whether it's appropriate or inappropriate. That needs to be taught more explicitly, the appropriateness and inappropriateness. But students are going to learn quickly what works and what doesn't work in terms of getting what they want with their behaviors. So there's a few things to consider when a student may be engaging in an ineffective behavior, something that's not getting them what they want. The first reason is that it may be a physiological deficit. The student may not be physically able to do what you're asking them to do, or etc. And so an example of this is that, like, let's say a student has low vision and they don't have glasses. sitting them in the back of the classroom and asking them to read, what's on the chalkboard, what's on the whiteboard, they're physically not going to be able to do that because of their low vision. So they physically can't read from far away unless there's some sort of medical intervention or accommodation provided, right? They get glasses, they're able to do that. They move up to the front of the classroom, they're able to see the board, they're able to read. A student that uses a wheelchair physically cannot climb up and down stairs because that's a physiological issue. So there's accommodations about ramps and such that are able to have the student do what you're asking them to do. But so the first cause is physiological. You have to consider, is the student not able to do this because of a physical reason? The second reason is a skill deficit. Has the student not learned how to perform a behavior? So asking a student to read who's never been taught to read is a skill deficit. They physically can see the paper, they can hold the book, they can, sound out. Well, they may not have learned how to sound out, but they're physically able to read. They just haven't been taught what letters are, what the sounds of the letters, how they blend together, comprehension. So a skill deficit is just meaning that the student hasn't been taught how to do so. And so thinking of behaviors, if a student hasn't been taught how to line up quietly and follow procedures of, walking to the next classroom, right? It's a skill deficit. They're physically able to line up and walk, but they haven't been taught that that's the expectation. And so when the student has a skill deficit, like anything, and this is kind of like in academics, we teach them the skill, they practice it, we support them, we encourage them, we teach them the skill to do so. And so that's the same with behaviors. If a student hasn't learned how to share, how to get along with others, how to express their emotions, how to calm down if they're really upset, right? We teach them strategies of how to like breathe deeply, count backwards, whatever the strategy is, actually teaching that skill is important. And then the third reason is called performance deficit. And this is where the student may not be motivated to perform the behavior. They physically can do it. They've been taught how to do it and they've practiced it. So they have the skill set to do it, but there's some sort of lack of motivation. Like they don't want to because they don't value what it's going to get them or for other sort of performance reasons. So physiologically, skills and performance are the three reasons you have to consider when observing a student and trying to question, well, why isn't the student doing, what I'm asking them to do? Is it a physiological deficit, a skill deficit, or a performance? And based on what it is, you can then address the problem differently. So now we're going to look at how behavior operates. And we put this into, it's called a three-term contingency, the ABC. ABC stands for the antecedent, B, the behavior, and then C, the consequence. Antecedent is what happens before a behavior. B is the actual behavior itself. And then C is the consequence, what happens after the behavior. Sometimes consequence is translated in English as a bad thing. The student performs, he's going to get a consequence. Well, in ABA, consequence simply means what happens after the behavior. Whether it's good, whether it's bad, it doesn't matter. It's simply what follows the behavior, what happens. So we have an ABC contingency. So here's an example of an ABC contingency. Say the class is quietly working on a task. They're doing their worksheet quietly. Andy makes a joke. That's the behavior. I tell a joke. I make a silly sound. I make a joke, something like that. And the class laughs, right? The consequence after I tell the joke is they laugh. So working quietly, antecedent, I make a joke, the class laughs, right? That's the ABC contingency of that specific behavior of me being a clown and making a joke. So what's helpful about the ABC contingency is when you think about a behavior, when you observe a behavior, you're able to look and see, what's happening here before, what is the behavior, and then what's happening after. And understanding that three-term contingency, you can then manipulate, change the antecedent, or change the consequence so that the behavior changes. So you're able to look at it across and then do things about the antecedent and the consequence to then change the behavior. Whether you want that behavior to continue, right? Or if you want that behavior to not continue. So in this instance, you probably don't want the joke making to continue because it's disruptive and things like that. Again, here's another example of the ABC contingency. So the class is reading round robin, right? Where the class is reading a paragraph, and then it goes to the next student. They read a paragraph. They go to the next student, read a paragraph or a sentence or something like that. So the class is reading round robin, and the teacher says, "All right, Mohammed, it's your turn to read." Well, Mohammed, he starts coughing, and he motions like he has to go get a drink of water. As a consequence of that, the teacher skips Muhammad and calls on another student. So class is reading round robin. Muhammad starts coughing. He says he has to go get a drink of water. And so he doesn't have to read. He actually gets to get out of the activity. The teacher calls on the next student. We'll get into the function of behavior shortly, but looking at this, what do you think's happening here with Muhammad? Why do you think he really started coughing and needed to get a drink of water, or was that sort of like something that he created so that he didn't have to read round robin? Right? When you start thinking about it, it's like, okay, perhaps Muhammad's doing something so that he doesn't have to read for whatever reason. Maybe he doesn't have the skill set. He's not a good reader, and he knows if he tries to read, he might feel embarrassed and he might be made fun of or whatever read. And so maybe that skill deficit is kind of the reason that he's trying to escape from reading. So this is just a simple example of how every behavior, regardless of the complexity of it, every behavior can be put into a three-term contingency. It can be looked at from the ABC aspect. And as a teacher, you can start investigating about what's happening before and what's happening after to understand why this is happening. And so like I said, once you put a behavior into the ABC perspective, you can alter the antecedents or you can alter the consequences to then curb the behavior that you want to continue or you want to change and maybe replace it with something that's a little more appropriate. And so to do that, you first have to look at the functions of behavior. Why does behavior occur? And in ABA, in science, right, we have identified that there are four functions of behavior. There's four reasons that behavior happens. And we'll look at all four of those. So the first one, people do what they do. And I'll say people because it's all people, adults, kids, but students do what they do for four reasons. One of them is for attention. A student engages in a behavior to receive attention. So an example is that Sarah screams every time her father walks away from her. When she engages in this screaming behavior, her father returns and says, "What's wrong?" This behavior is attention maintained because the behavior consistently results in attention. When Sarah wants attention from her father, she screams. So her father is walking away. Sarah screams. Her dad comes back and says, "What's wrong?" So Sarah is getting that attention. Her screaming, the screaming behavior, is attention maintained because she knows that when she screams, she's going to get that attention from her father. Students in classrooms often have a lot of attention maintained behaviors. Students love attention from their peers. They love attention from the teacher. And so a lot of behaviors are attention maintained from students. Another function of a behavior could be to escape. A student engages in a behavior to end or avoid something they do not like. Think back to Muhammad. and his coughing and getting the water. He was escaping having to perform the activity. So he engaged in that behavior to escape. As another example, every time the teacher puts a vocabulary worksheet on Stella's desk, she rips up the paper and throws it on the floor. As a result, the teacher does not make her do her vocabulary homework. In the future, Stella continues to engage in this behavior every time she receives a vocabulary worksheet because it results in escaping the vocabulary work. So the antecedent is the student is sitting there right in the classroom. Teacher gives her a vocabulary worksheet. The behavior is Stella rips it up, throws it on the floor. The consequence of that is that she doesn't have to do the vocabulary homework. She escapes it. She escapes from the activity. So the maintenance, the function of Stella's behavior is to escape. A third function of behavior is tangibles. It's to engage in a behavior to get something, an item or an activity. A tangible is something you can grab or hold. You can't really hold an activity, but it's something to actually get something. We had attention, we had escape, and now we have a tangible. So, as an example, Joey wants a toy from his friend. During playtime, Joey hits his friend, and it results in his friend dropping the toy and crying. As a result of the hit, Joey now has access to the toy he wanted, right? Joey gets the toy. His hitting behavior will continue. It'll most likely continue because he realized that when he hits a friend, he's more than likely will get the toy that he wanted. So to get the toy, Joey has learned that hitting results in that toy. So you think to yourself, is that an appropriate way to get the toy? Well, we would say no. That is an inappropriate way for Joey to interact with peers to get the toy. However, it's a very effective way. Joey has learned that that's an effective way to get the toy from his friend. It's not appropriate, but it's effective. The ABC contingency is Joey wants the toy, friends playing with the toy. The behavior is Joey hits. The consequence is Joey gets the toy. So it's tangible, maintained, is that's an effective way for Joey to get that tangible is by hitting his friend. A way to counter that is to then teach Joey that there's more appropriate ways and as effective to get the toy, right? By talking, asking, things like that. But looking at it through the ABC contingency is that Joey is hitting to get that toy. The fourth function of behavior is what we call sensory. So an individual engages in a behavior because it physically feels good or relieves something that physically feels bad. So for example, Derek, he plugs his ears when students are shouting out answers. The behavior provides sensory stimulation as it reduces loud noises for Derek. So let's say Derek is sensitive to loud noises in the classroom. Antecedent, students are shouting answers, calling out answers, being loud. The behavior, Derek plugs his ears. The consequence is that he escapes from that loud sensory noise. So he doesn't have to hear that sensory overstimulation. So he's avoiding the unpleasant feeling of the loud noise. Oftentimes, another classic example of a sensory is if you have an itch on your arm, the antecedent, you feel an itch. The behavior is you scratch it and the itch goes away, right? That feeling of the itch, it goes away. A pleasant sensory function of behavior is if you're hungry, you go and eat food, you feel full, right? You've satisfied that sensory need of hunger. And so antecedent, you're hungry, you go and eat. Consequence is that you're full and that hunger is no longer there. So the four functions of behavior: attention, escape, tangible, and sensory. When you put behaviors into the ABC contingency, you can then start thinking, all right, what's happening? What is the behavior? And then what's the consequence? What is the function and what's the student receiving or escaping that's maintaining that behavior. And then knowing that, you can intervene to do something about it. So let's do a couple more examples. Every time Miss Joan places a demand on her daughter, Kiki, Kiki falls to the ground and screams, so she starts having a tantrum. As a result, Miss Joan avoids putting demands on her daughter. In the future, Kiki continues to engage in this behavior every time a demand is placed on her. So Miss Joan asks her daughter to do something. Her daughter has a tantrum, so she doesn't have to do what she's doing. The maintaining function of the behavior is escape, right? Kiki's escaping the demands. When Jenna screams, her mother gives her a baby doll. In the future, Jenna screams because it constantly results in the access to the doll. So Jenna wants the doll, she screams. Her behavior is a tangible. She's screaming to get the baby doll. She's not screaming to avoid anything. She's not screaming to get attention. She's not screaming because it feels good. She's screaming to get something, and that's a tangible baby doll. Every time Damon walks into the classroom, he starts dancing on his way to his desk. His classmates laugh at him. This is probably a pretty common classroom behavior, and it's attention maintained. Damon wants that attention from his peers. He's the class clown. He starts dancing. His classmates laugh. He loves that attention. And so, whether that's appropriate or inappropriate, disruptive or not appropriate, if you understand that Damon is doing a behavior for attention, right, you can address it, perhaps provide other ways that he can get attention without disrupting the class, etc. Alex chews on his pencil. He often bites the eraser off the end of the pencil. So Alex has some sort of habit of chewing pencils and biting erasers. And it's destroying pencils. He goes through pencils. It's a pain. He has to borrow pencils, all that stuff. Probably a sensory issue. Not doing it for attention, not doing it to escape, not doing it to get anything tangible. Oftentimes, those habits can be sensory. It feels good. The sensation of biting a pencil, etc., could be a sensory issue, and so that could be the function of that behavior. All right, so we talked about the four functions of behavior and putting it into an ABC contingency. So here's a couple strategies about manipulating the antecedent, the environment, before behaviors occur. And there's a whole host of them. I'm just going to run through, maybe 10 of them or so. So first, an antecedent strategy is to clarify expectations. This is called pre-correct, remind students of expectations before the activities. So like we said, students need to be taught how to behave, how to do certain activities. They may not have the skill, they might not have had that practice. So before everyone, lines up to be dismissed at the end of the day, reminding students, all right, this is how we line up. This is how we push in our chairs. This is how we get our bags. We keep our hands to ourselves. That pre-correction, clarifying the expectations, helps remind students before some undesirable, inappropriate behaviors occur. At the same time, having structured routines is really important as an antecedent strategy so that students know what to expect. In classrooms, predictability is a good thing. Predictability helps students know how to turn in papers, how to get into small groups, how to come into class and get started, how to exit class, all those sorts of things, whether they're supposed to raise their hand or just shout out answers, right? That's a routine that needs to be taught. Visual schedules is always a helpful thing to show like, all right, this is what we're doing first. This is what we're going to do next, right? Having that predictability is good. Even think of yourselves, when you go into a meeting, it's helpful to kind of know what's coming so that you can check off, the list. Sometimes modifying the environment, right? Seating arrangements, having materials accessible to where if a student needs another pencil, they know how to quietly get up and go get that pencil and not disrupt the whole class, to ask for a pencil, to bother their friend for a pencil, etc. If two students love to chat and joke around together, you separate them, right? These seating arrangements are modifying the environment as a proactive strategy to prevent undesirable behaviors from occurring. Offering choice is another antecedent intervention because it provides students the opportunity to have some autonomy where, you know, sometimes students have power struggles or they want to do what they want to do just because there's like they want to have that power. But with, it doesn't have to get into a battle with teachers. You can simply provide a choice, so you can either do this or you can do that, and give them the choice and to avoid any sort of power struggles. Opportunities to respond, OTR, such as choral responding. And like we talked about at the very beginning, academic instruction, right, instructional designing a lesson is really important for student engagement. If students have the opportunity to respond back and provide answers, right, they're going to be more engaged. If you're up here just lecturing for a long time, like I'm doing in this PD because it's recorded, right? There's no interaction that's happening, and so engagement might go down. And that's the same with students who have even more of a limited, window of focus. Is like they need to be engaged, and so asking questions, getting responses back helps. And so that's called OTR. Positive attention, right? Like I discussed earlier, students love, not all students, but most students love that attention, especially the younger students. Older students, high schoolers, tend to not like that personal attention, right? They don't want to be called out in front of their peers, but little kids loved attention. So giving scheduled positive attention before behaviors occur is a great thing, called behavior specific praise, BSP. You provide that attention. Johnny, I love how you're sitting there, working quietly. Great job. Thank you for raising your hand. That's the right behavior if you want to answer a question, right? Giving that regularly scheduled positive behavior specific attention or that behavior specific praise is a fantastic proactive classroom management strategy because students want that attention. So rather than waiting for them to kind of act out to get attention, you give it to them more regularly, and on-task behaviors increase. Another strategy is using proximity control, where you are walking around and you're next to students to help control their impulses. Being close to students, that proximity is a strategy. Interest boosting is where you display interest in the child's work to help them increase motivation to continue working on the assignment. Those words of encouragement, telling them that they're doing a great job, they're working so hard. That interest in their personal accomplishment is, rewarding in of itself. Children feel like that is that positive attention is great. And another thing is called hurdle help or behavior momentum. So if a student is starting to become frustrated or overwhelmed or unmotivated, let's say that the task is a little challenging, they don't really understand it quite yet. It's they're still learning. They can get frustrated and then kind of want to give up and escape, right? If they're frustrated and feeling like they're not doing well, they're going to want to escape, so they may perform some undesirable behavior to do so. So getting students that behavior momentum where they're getting some successes, helping them to kind of feel like, okay, I can do this now, right? That is going to get them over that hump. So that's a very good proactive strategy. All right, so we're getting close to the end here. A couple concepts to talk about now is the consequence aspect. Just ran through a variety of antecedent strategies. But now what happens after a behavior occurs really depends on whether it's reinforced or it's punished. So affecting behavior through consequence. And remember, consequence is neither good or bad. It's simply what happens after a behavior. So if we want that behavior to increase, we look at reinforcing that behavior. So let's say the student is doing the right thing and you want them to continue doing the right thing in the future. You want to provide additional reinforcement. So reinforcement means it's a consequence that strengthens the behavior. To strengthen a behavior means to increase the likelihood that it will again happen in the future. So an example of a reinforcement just in everyday life, let's say you wake up with a headache. So you get up and you take an aspirin. Afterwards, the headache is gone, right? The aspirin worked. in the future, the next time you get a headache, you're likely going to take aspirin straight away because it did it did what you wanted it to do. It got rid of the headache. But the behavior of taking the aspirin, you'll likely do that again in the future because it worked. So your behavior of taking aspirin is going to increase because it works. Another example of reinforcement is your phone beeps and you see it's a message from a friend. And say you tap open the message and it's a funny video that makes you laugh. In the future, when your friend texts, you're likely going to open their message because their funny video in the past was funny and you enjoyed it. It was reinforcing. So in the future, you're likely going to open messages because of that pleasant, sensory stimulation of joy and laughing. So the behavior is maintained through sensory because it was funny and enjoyable. So it's going to increase. So anytime you want a behavior to increase, you want the consequence, what follows the behavior, to be enjoyable, rewarding, something that's going to continue to increase that behavior in the future. So thinking about a student behavior, if a student's doing the right thing, how do you provide a reinforcement for that behavior so that it increases or continues in the future? On the flip end is called punishment. It's a consequence that is designed to weaken or decrease a behavior. So as an example, let's say you're driving over the speed limit and a police officer gives you a speeding ticket. You get pulled over, you get a speeding ticket, you stop speeding and drive the speed limit. So your behavior of driving fast is now decreased because the punishment was a speeding ticket and you don't want to pay speeding tickets. So in the future, you drive the speed limit, your behavior has decreased as a result of that punishment of the ticket. So another example, let's say a student is arguing with the teacher. The teacher says that if they don't stop arguing, they're going to call home. Well, the student stops arguing because that consequence, the teacher says, hey, I'm going to call home unless you stop arguing. That was a strong enough punishment that the student decided to stop arguing because they didn't want that phone call home. So that consequence of arguing was decreased by threatening to call home. So whenever you think about the ABC contingency, there's antecedent strategies you can do to affect the behavior, to prevent it from happening. But then there's also consequence strategies that you can do to either increase what you want to see or decrease what you don't want to see. And by increasing future behaviors, you reinforce. Reinforce increases future behaviors. What are things, and it depends on the function of the behavior. So if the student is doing something to maintain, to get attention, how can you provide attention in maybe a more appropriate way so that that behavior increases? And at the same time, punishment decreases behaviors. So you can look at the ABC contingency of the behavior and either think about how do you reinforce it, the behavior you want, or punish to reduce the behavior that you don't want. And so those, antecedents and consequences can kind of go hand in hand, but you first have to take a behavior and break it down into the ABC to kind of understand what's going on, and then looking at why is the student doing what they're doing, whether it's something that you like and you want them to continue doing, or whether it's something you don't like and you don't want them to continue. You have to understand the function of the behavior first. Why are they doing what they're doing? Then you can look at the antecedent and the consequences. So that's all for this professional development. This was just a little introduction into classroom management and sort of surface levels. There gets into a lot more details and things like that, but we didn't want to go too far into the weeds of classroom management. So like I said at the beginning, I am Dr. Andy Markels at James Madison University. My email is there. If you want to reach out with any questions, Dr. Muhammad Corral couldn't be a part of delivering the professional development, but he was integral in designing the survey and looking at the content of it. He's going to help with the translation services and everything. And so it's a pleasure working with Dr. Corral at Sinop University as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.